Hello, this is Mark Hilliard from Beyond 20. Today I want to talk about required fields and state changes within objects that have life cycles. This is going to most commonly show up in change requests because there are different types of changes out of the box, and most customers do have multiple change types and multiple status or life cycle paths. So Cherwell obviously allows you to require fields in order to save a record in the system. However, when you're talking about something like change where you may have different requirements for different types, you might not want to always require the same field depending on type. Now, what you could do is you could go into your change and you could say, okay, ownership is required based on an expression, and I could write this very long expression that says, okay, well, if it's a normal change type, then owner is required when we go to approval. If it's a standard change, owner is required when we go to implementation. If it's all of these different things, I could write this very, very long expression, and the more complicated or complex your change process is, the longer that expression becomes. Rather than doing that, however, Cherwell gives us this state section in our properties. Now, this only works on objects that have a life cycle defined, and in order to define a life cycle in the business object properties, you have to define a life cycle. And what you want to do when you have the life cycle is you want to make sure that all of the statuses where you may need to do something are defined here. In this case, with this particular system, you'll see we've got a new tech approval, pending change review, so on and so forth. You want all of these because when you go to set up your field requirements, you need to be able to pick the right state from the life cycle. This is not a status from the status table. This is a life cycle state specific to this particular object, and all of the different statuses that you add to the life cycle will show up. So in this case, again, we want to make it required to be in a certain status. So if we expand this out, you can see all the states that we've added to the life cycle. So new, and of course this is in alphabetical order, not in actual state order, but new and emergency approval and service owner approval and review, resolve, so on. All these different statuses that may require me to fill out a field. Now, in the case of now, my default is generally set up to not require for state change. Now, you could make it always required and then turn it off as you move along. There are benefits to doing it either way, but by default, it's never required. However, if this particular field is required for a certain status, say for instance, I must have an owner before I put it into service owner approval, I can go in here and say, okay, instead of using the default setting, I can make it required when it goes to service owner approval. Always. It always must be filled out before we go to service owner approval. Similarly, and I can do that for each different one. So in order to go to cab approval, then it has to be there. In order to go to technical approval, it's actually already set up for that. So I can decide what states that I have to have this particular field filled out for. Now that gives me some flexibility. So when I'm sitting in the actual change, I'm just going to go ahead and create a new change. This is the client portion of that same system. You'll see that I have required fields showing up here, and let's just say I go to an emergency change that has the fewest required fields. You'll see all these required fields. Now I do have my my status is disabled for things that are required to even save the record. So if I click save here, I have several fields that are actually required all the time. Description, reason, title, environment, business approval. So all those things must actually be filled out before I even save it. So I don't even actually give a submit for approval until I actually fill out at least the required fields. So we'll just say we're going to do all these different things. It's an emergency, so we're going to be starting like right here. Business approval I need. Now once I do that, excellent. And then of course it needs to have an approver assigned to it. So let's just pick an approver out of here. Now it says I can submit for approval, except I don't have all of my required fields filled out. I can save it right here. It's now savable. But if I go to try to change the status and submit this for approval, I'm actually going to get an error. And that error tells me that I must have my DR environment field filled in before I can change it to approval. So I got to go find that particular field, and I have to go ahead and fill it out. There it is. Now if I say, does it have a DR environment? Yes. Now I can actually submit it for approval. And now it works. So what this does is it gives people a bit of a guide in order to make sure that they get all the required fields before moving to the next status. However, it does not, because again, rather than having to build out a massive expression for every single required field for each status for each type of change, I can simply make those fields required to change state. And then when I go to try to move to a state where they're required, if I don't have them filled out, it's going to throw an error at me. I hope this is a helpful piece of information for you. And of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on our website at www.beyond20.com. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel at Beyond20LLC. And follow us on Twitter at Beyond20LLC. Thanks.